Welcome to the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. I'm Allie Rose, certified clinical hypnotherapist and subconscious success coach. I help my clients stop self-sabotage and feel safe to create more wealth, worth, and wellness from within. If you find yourself stuck repeating the same unhelpful patterns in your life, health, business, or relationships, even after all the mindset work, this podcast is for you. Each week, you'll hear deep dives into the hidden beliefs shaping your life and live hypno coaching sessions where someone shifts a block in real time. Because willpower isn't the problem, your subconscious story is. And when you shift it at the root, everything else begins to change. So let's dive in. Hello. Welcome back to the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. Today, we're talking about identity, what it actually is, how it gets formed, how it can shape the way you think, choose, show up, and move through your life, and what it really looks like to shift it at a subconscious level. Because so many people are trying to change their habits, their relationships, their businesses, their body, or their life without realizing that underneath all of that is an identity that may still be rooted in old stories, old pain, old roles, and old ways of surviving. So, in this episode, we're going to unpack what identity really means. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's different than personality, why identity shifts can feel so uncomfortable, and how subconscious work and hypnotherapy can help you start creating change at the root instead of just on the surface. If you've ever felt like part of you knows that you're meant for more or something different, but another part of you keeps pulling you back into old patterns, old fears, or old ways of being, this episode is going to hit home. But as always, before we dive in, Sophia, how are you today? How are you feeling about this conversation?
I'm feeling good. I feel like this is a cliche because every time we talk, I say, I'm really looking forward to this. This is one of my favorite topics, but this is actually one of my favorite topics. And
Yeah.
so I'm looking forward to today.
Great. Wonderful. Yeah. So let's dive in.
Yes, let us dive in, beginning where I love to begin with some definition, some sort of framing, because obviously one of the things you said in your intro is how, identity is different to personality. So I'm curious, when you say identity, what are you referring to specifically?
Yeah. So for me, I'm really talking about that internal sense of who you believe that you are. It's the story that you carry about yourself. And I don't think we talk about it in that way. We're not talking to ourselves all day saying, this is my identity. This is my identity. So
Mm,
there's stories that you often carry without even realizing that you're carrying those stories. And it shows up in the way you think, the way you make decisions, the way you interpret what happens to you, the way that you expect life to respond to you. And it's very different than habits and goals, different than mindset, and different than personality. Because to me, personality is more about your natural traits and tendencies. And I believe that identity goes deeper than that. They intermingle.
mm,
However, I believe that they are different because identity is not just how you are, it's who you believe yourself to be. And it's more about the meaning that you have attached to yourself over time. So let me give you an example. So someone can have a quiet personality and still carry an identity of being powerful. And I kind of think about myself in that way. I think that when people engage with me, I'm not the loudest person in the room, but I do feel like I carry a powerful identity.
mm.
Or to the opposite, someone can be outgoing and still carrying an identity of being too much or overlooked or not enough, right? And so they might consciously want one thing, but subconsciously keep recreating another from their identity, right? So when I'm talking about shifting your identity, I'm talking about more than just changing your thoughts. I'm talking about changing the patterns and the stories that your mind and your body and your subconscious have accepted as true about who you are and the kind of life that's possible for you. And when I say accepted that they're true, because sometimes a lot of times, they can not be true about who you are or what's possible for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, it makes a lot of sense. And I like what you say when you say accept it as true because I think not only can they sometimes not be true, like, sometimes they don't have to be true, right? Like, other things can also be true as well. And so I think it's really hard sometimes to see those or to and almost to feel uncomfortable with those other things that can be true if they feel like they brush up against what you think is true.
Right.
Um,
Right. And the other thing is too, is that I think with things with personality, they don't often change. They can change-ish, but I think more of identity being something that is a bit more changeable. Like, I can change certain identities about myself, and I have. And at the same time, if you were to ask people that knew me whenever I was 5, 10, 15, 20, up till now 40, there are certain things about my personality that they would say have stayed the same, even
mm,
though my identity has changed.
yeah, I can definitely say the same as well. Maybe we can give some examples later because I've been writing about it a little bit recently as well, just around some of my own identity shifts. So yeah, then we can get into some
Yeah.
examples. But before we do that, you talk about identities being wrapped up in the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we believe about ourselves. How much do you think of that identity of those stories are actually ours that maybe we built? And how much of it do you think is inherited or absorbed either from the family, from culture, from wider society?
So it's a very powerful question because so much of what people call their identity is actually not something that they consciously chose. A huge portion of identity is inherited before we even realize that it's happening because we often learn who we are in relationship to the people around us. We learn it through our family system, through the emotional environment we grew up in, through culture, right? I mean, we talk about it in terms of like millennials versus Gen X or versus boomers, those kinds of things, through religion or school or the trauma we've experienced, through whether we got praised or criticized. A child does not sit down and logically decide, oh, I'm too much. I'm not enough. I have to be good in order to be loved, or I can't trust people, or money's stressful, right? Those are
Mm.
conclusions that get formed through lived experience.
Yes. And what's interesting, I think, is that, quite often when people think about their identities in a almost in a demographic sense,
Mhm.
there are these things that you're kind of born with, like, your sex, your skin color, your culture, your whatever. And and then you take on messages about the person that you are
Right.
to form that identity as well. So I've been thinking about it recently because this is really random, but I've been thinking about salary negotiations and I'm thinking to myself, like, a man would do X and a woman would do what? Like
Right.
just these real they're stereotypes, right? But it also frames the way that I make those decisions as well by the identities that I've both born into and then been socialized in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's the reality is that it doesn't mean that, like, none of our identity is ours. It just means that a lot of what we think is our deepest truth might
Mm.
actually be our deepest conditioning, right? And I think that that's really freeing because if something was learned, that means that it can also be unlearned. And I think that real healing of different identities often begins when people realize, like, this is not just who you are. This is who I became in response to what I have lived through. And it's interesting because I think we've talked about this before, but even with two people who grew up in the same household, their identities can be formed so differently. And they grew up in the same environment. They can look very similar, have the same parents, have gone to the same school. And because of what they experienced, they became very different people, right?
Oh, yeah, and even going back to some of, what you talked about when you talked about, like, boomers, millennials, I often think about the sort of birth order. It's like, sometimes I'll say something to a friend and she'll be like, "Oh, you're such a middle child," and I'm like, "What?" So it just even growing up in the same house with I have 2 sisters, we are so different, and, there are all those things that I always say, no 2 people have the same parents, even the 2 people that have the same parents.
Right.
So, there is so much involved in it. Now, one of the things that you said is kind of a really powerful shift is, like, if this is something I've learned, I can unlearn it.
Right.
So, why do people stay stuck then in identities even when they're clearly not serving them?
Because our subconscious mind is not asking, oh, is this identity helping me thrive? It's often asking, is this familiar? Does it help me survive? Does it help me feel safe? And those are very different things, right? So people stay stuck in identities that hurt them because those identities still feel emotionally and neurologically familiar. And even painful identities, they can feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. It's like, you think about you want to break out of a certain identity, but it's like that feels unfamiliar. Even if it will bring you more freedom,
Mm,
that can bring up danger and risk. And it's not because the new identity is wrong or bad, but because it's unfamiliar. And the body can interpret that unfamiliarity as danger, even whenever it's what you want or growth, right? And so many people cling to those old identities because it gave them structure or belonging or protection or predictability at some point in their life, right? I think another big thing in that is also loyalty. So some people stay attached to identity because it connects them to family, to their childhood, to old wounds, to the version of themselves that learned how to cope, or, we get connected to old versions of ourselves, right? And so letting go of that identity can feel like betrayal. It can feel like losing your place in the system that you came from or disrespecting your family or even a younger version of you. So
yeah.
people don't stay stuck for no reason. There's always a reason, right? And I think that that's been one of the really beautiful things in the work that I do is helping people realize, like, hey, there's a reason why you're staying stuck. It's not just because you're lazy or undisciplined or you're not trying hard enough. It's because some part of you believes that this old identity is still serving a purpose in your life.
Yeah, and I often think about that when people want change, but also have almost those voices in your head from, like, your parents and your family and societal influences that make you feel like this is your place, and yeah, I've definitely felt that. I've definitely had conversations over the years with people. They say they want or I think they even do want things, but it is hard to move out from under the identity that feels so familiar.
Absolutely. So, one of the biggest things that I've seen this in is I grew up in a town where, unfortunately, a lot of people fell into addiction, whether that was drugs or alcohol. And addiction is really one of the hardest things to break in terms of your identity. And what I often see, and then I worked in drug and alcohol later in my life. And what you often see is that when someone returns back to the place where they were active in their addiction, their percentage of staying in recovery greatly decreases because they're around that same environment, those same people when they were around when they were active in their addiction. What I see is that a lot of people who are successful in their recovery, and this is obviously not a blanket statement, I do know people who have returned back and they are still in recovery. When they go away from that environment and from those people in those places, is that they're able to create a new identity because the people in that new place, right? It's not the same familiar triggers and habits and patterns. And those people don't know them as being an active addiction. They know them as a clean and sober version of themselves, right? That's
Yeah.
really where I've seen it most pronounced in my life.
Yeah, I can definitely get that. And we talked a little bit about people staying stuck in identities. And I think that can then almost lead to sabotage, right? Where you say you want something different,
Right.
and yet you feel like you're almost self-sabotaging yourself back into that identity that is comfortable, that is familiar. And it almost, when you talk about the identity and the relationship to the subconscious, it's almost like your conscious mind has made your decision, but your subconscious mind hasn't fully caught up yet. I know you gave the addiction example, but like, do you feel that that's something that can happen in terms of like you've consciously made the decision, but subconsciously you kind of not there yet?
All the time. I mean, I don't think I would have a job if if when someone made a conscious decision about something and then they just went after it and all felt well within them. Usually people end up on, my quote unquote doorstep whenever they're like, I've been trying to do this thing or I've been meaning to leave this relationship and I just
Mm.
can't seem to do it because it's very hard to consistently hold what does not yet feel like it belongs to you. Like it belongs to someone else. I see that someone else has it, but it doesn't yet belong to me. And so that's really when sabotage comes in. It's not a lack of desire, it's an identity mismatch. You haven't allowed your self identity to shift and change enough that it has caught up with the thing that you are saying that you want, right? So I
Yeah.
work with a lot of business owners, and they may say that they want a thriving business, but if their identity is still rooted in being, rejected or that it feels unsafe being seen, then it's going to be hard to have a business if you don't put yourself out there and you don't feel safe being seen. And that creates a tension or a pressure. And that tension and that pressure leads to self-sabotage because it's like the floor falls out from underneath you because it was too much pressure for your system to hold, and then the self-sabotage comes in because it's kind of collapsed under the weight of holding on to that old identity.
Yeah. So one of the things I know you sort of started off by saying is that you have definitely gone through some identity shifts, and I have as well. And I feel like we can chat about that in a minute. But first of all, how do people know when they're actually in the identity shift?
So the interesting thing is it's almost like I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but it almost feels like life starts to get really weird. Like strange in a way that you can't fully explain. It doesn't really begin with clarity of like, "Oh, today I'm embarking on my identity shift." It usually begins with like this dissonance of what used to fit in your life. It suddenly starts to feel off, or what used to feel normal starts to feel heavy or irritating or really misaligned. The roles or relationships or goals or habits or way of being that once really made sense to you, it no longer feels like it fits or it's not like home anymore. But the new version of you is not fully formed yet either. So you kind of feel like this wanderer in this middle space of the old way doesn't really fit me yet, but the new way is not fully formed.
Yeah, I definitely get that. Do you find, because obviously we just talked a lot about how, a lot of these identities live in the subconscious, people decide that they want to shift consciously, but the subconscious may not catch up. Do you think that someone can shift that identity from a conscious decision?
I think that the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, they're always communicating. So I don't think that it's like just because you consciously say something that the subconscious mind doesn't hear that. But I think that it takes more than just you saying, I want this thing consciously. There you then have to become really aware. You have to become aware
Mm.
of the habits and the patterns and how those might be out of alignment with what you are saying that you want. It's like a process. You have to look at, well, why? Because there's a lot of failure that's involved in identity shifting because what typically happens is someone says, I want something. Okay, they set some sort of goal and they start logically making a plan to go toward it. And then, as I said, it starts to build up like that pressure and that tension. And that's where the subconscious starts to feel like, whoa, wait a minute, what is she doing? The last time that she tried to do this, X, Y, and Z happened and it turned out really bad. This feels
Mhm.
like too much pressure. The change feels like too much pressure. And so, as I said, it's like the bottom drops out, you sabotage, and you kind of go back. But the beautiful thing is that you haven't gone back to square one. You haven't gone back to zero because you've made the effort. And if you're willing to look at the quote unquote failure or the mess up moment or when the bottom dropped out, and you're able to be like, huh, be curious about it. What was that about? Like, what was happening right up to the point when I sabotaged or whenever I did X, Y, or Z, or when I didn't do X, Y, or Z? You know, okay, maybe I was moving too quickly. Maybe I need to take smaller steps. Maybe I need to be more aware. How can I set myself up for success when I reach that point again? Right. I think there's so much awareness and analyzing that goes into it. Mind learns through repetition. So
Y
the more that you ingrain something as habit, but really when I say that, it's not about doing 500 things all at once. It's more about doing you can do small things over time and then your subconscious more easily adopts that because it's become more familiar. But the
Yes.
problem is most people dive into the deep end and are like, I'm going to do 500 things to change who I am. And the system literally goes into overload and is like, no way, bottom drops out, you're back where you
Mm.
were before.
Yeah, I get that, and you talk about safety, and I think about the nervous system, and doing the small steps almost allows you to acclimatize to a point where your nervous system can kind of like, "Oh, okay, this is different, but actually I can handle it," and then the next, kind of take the next step from there. Now, I'm curious because I know you said that with hypnotherapy, you can work a lot with people who want to work on their identity.
Mhm.
How how is using hypnotherapy for identity change different to that conscious decision, trial and error? Is it different? I mean, I'm assuming you may still have to go through some trial and error.
So the reason why it's different is because in a hypnotherapy session, we allow that conscious part to quiet. And so what we can really work with is the subconscious mind in terms of really understanding why you might be sabotaging yourself or holding yourself back from what it is that you want. Once you
Mhm.
have the awareness, number one, of why it's happening, and we connect it back to different scenes in someone's childhood. Oh, it makes a lot more sense. So, first, what that does is that invites a lot more compassion into the process because you're like, oh, I'm not just incompetent and incapable. I have this part of me that is responding and reacting as if I was a 5-year-old who this thing was happening to me, right? And then we talk to the actual part that's stopping someone from getting what they want. And we ask that part when it was formed, why it was formed, and what it needs from you as an adult to move forward feeling safe. And I'll tell you, the thing is that's so interesting after doing hundreds and hundreds of sessions now is that the thing that the part often needs, it's never a huge change. It's always some sort of small shift. It's never like, oh, yeah, well, I need you to completely overhaul the way that you're doing X, Y, and Z. A lot of times it's this very minute shift that the part needs in order to feel safe enough to release from someone's life. And we often can't get that when I'm talking with someone consciously because
Mhm.
that's why they're there. If I could consciously talk to someone and say, "Well, why do you think that you X, Y, and Z?" and they were able to tell me, we wouldn't need hypnotherapy in order
Mhm.
to do it, right?
Yeah. And then, like you said, I think it's understanding why is that part still serving you, even if it's almost a little bit twisted in how it's kind of showing up
Yes.
now that you are no longer in the situation where this was created,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So I think about it sometimes with money, and I think about it with creativity, right? And so if you're in a habit of not feeling safe holding on to money, and that was created for a reason, but you don't really the reason doesn't make any sense now that you're a grown person with a job and a mortgage and everything. Like it's
Right.
almost hard to comprehend the role that the part is still playing, right? And so I guess if you can switch off that sort of like logical thinking, you can actually speak directly to that.
Absolutely. And so it's funny that you bring that up. I'm thinking of obviously I do the coaching episodes and I just did a coaching episode where that exact thing was happening. She could not hold on to large sums of money in her
Mm,
account. And part of the reason was that when she was younger, if she had any money in her accounts as a child or as a teenager, her mom would take that money from her account because mom wasn't steady, stable, and grounded and needed the money to pay for rent or pay for groceries. So her subconscious mind learned it's not safe for me to hold on to money because if I hold on to money rather than just spend it right away, someone else will take it from me. And
mm,
so, wanting to have the power and the control, she then spent the money so that no one else could take it from her. Even though she logically knew that no one else is coming into my bank account to take my money, the subconscious part of her did not understand that she was now an adult and we had to upgrade that part of her.
yeah, yeah, that's I definitely understand that. That's so true. So yeah, so it's good. I can see how hypnotherapy can kind of allow you to work with that subconscious, with that part of you that came up with this solution, even if it doesn't make any logical sense, so that you can then talk to it. And would you almost say that that's the beginning of the identity shift? Because I think, you know, there's still you still have to reinforce it, I'm assuming.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's the beginning is knowing and having an understanding of how and why it was formed. And going back to some of the work that I do, often those parts, all they need is a thank you from the person. Like,
Mhm.
thank you for helping me. You've been trying to keep me safe. And then often a part releases and can relax a little bit. But yes, you absolutely have to practically reinforce that. So let's go with the example that I just gave, the coaching episode that I just talked about. Well, for her, it might look like, okay, how do you feel safe having, I'm going to make it up, $5 in your account, 10,
Mhm.
and then letting it grow, right?
Mhm.
And so part of it is like a checking in with your system of looking at the bank account and tuning into how you feel having that money in your accounts and then getting to that threshold, right? What I often say is like this like window of tolerance. It's like how do you expand your window of tolerance for distress? So you notice what level or what amount of money do I get to where I start to feel shaky and I start to feel like I want to spend it away. And then what you do is you say, we'll say, I'm going to allow $5,000 to sit in my account and I'm just going to let it sit there for a day. And after that, if I want to spend it on something, I can spend it on something. So then you let a day pass and you go back to it and it's still there and you still feel like, oh, okay, I did it. I made it through one day. What if I made it through another day? And you
Mhm.
kind of expand it in that way. But you give yourself the permission. Okay, you're going to go back to it. And if you want to spend it, you have the freedom to do that because that might be where that nervous system collapse comes in, where you feel like, "I gotta spend it," right? But if you tell yourself, "No, we're just gonna do it for one day," and then you have the freedom to do whatever you want. "Okay, let's try it for another day." And you expand that window of tolerance.
Mm. That's really good. So I guess that is what you are then doing to kind of start reinforcing that new identity in everyday life through your actions, and I guess through I don't wanna say retraining your nervous system because that sounds a bit, like,
But it
simplest.
is.
Oh, okay.
It is. It's a feelings thing, right? Because what I
Yeah.
said in that example is you look at the bank account, you notice how you feel, you notice the thoughts that come up, and then you have this little negotiation that goes on, and you're like, okay, what if we just let it sit there for one day? Okay. And then you come back to it. And again, you notice how you feel. That is retraining your nervous system about how to feel safe with something different.
Mm, yeah, I definitely get that. So I'm curious about, I are you up for talking a little bit about one of your identity shifts just for another
Sure.
example?
Yeah, I'm like, which one?
Which one? Let's anyone you like.
Uh Yeah, I think that the first one and the most recent one that I'm thinking about is my identity shift around my health and wellness. And I, over the last year and a half, have lost 30 pounds. And I've lost about 25 of those pounds since November of 2025. And so that's what, November, December, January, February, March, like 4 months. So I've lost about 25 pounds over 4 months.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like, what was that? You talked about that small thing that you might start with that can start the process of understanding how to let go of that old story. So, what was that first small sort of shift, do you think?
I think the first small shift was recognizing that I was stuck in the cycle. I was stuck in classically like a yo-yo pattern of I don't want to say like dieting, but like trying to lose weight or to better my health in some sort of way, and I would always bounce back. It was like I could only stick with it for a bit of time. And I think also a small step was realizing that I couldn't do it myself. So I actually did hire someone and I worked with someone, a doctor, and I had accountability check-ins once a week around it. But the shift really for me was like, honestly, it was being humble enough to say, I can't do this on my own. And then being tired of my own nonsense and my own shit. Like honestly, like I just was like, "Listen," I was like, I was just tired because we're so good at lying to ourselves, and I
Mm,
was just tired of lying to myself, like, "Oh, yeah, once the holidays pass, then X, Y, and Z is gonna happen." I
mm,
knew that that was a lie. I knew that that was a lie. I knew that I was gonna go through the holiday season in the same way that I went through every single holiday season up to that point, and that, yes, maybe once January came that I would put in my most concerted effort, but then I knew that I would end up back in the cycle. So I got tired of my own stuff, and so I recognized that I needed help outside of myself, and so I hired someone to help me.
okay. Interesting. And I'm interested to hear when you say it's a lie, because sometimes I wonder, like, when I'm telling myself stuff and I'm like, "Do I actually know it's a lie, or do I actually believe it? This time is gonna be different," even though
Right.
it's clearly not gonna be different. But you're right, I think eventually you know that if you're doing the same thing over and over again, then it clearly it's not gonna be different. Like, how could it possibly be
Right.
different?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and so then, okay, so to summarize it, I think that having the accountability helped. So the other thing was it was not some sort of extreme program. I still ate 3 meals a day. I just like shifted. I could still have a glass of wine if I wanted to have a glass of wine. It wasn't something that was extreme. So I think that that really helps because so often people do extreme things in order to get the shifts and changes that they need. But because it wasn't that, my system was much more open to adapting to it. I mean, it felt extreme because I was doing it during the holidays.
Yeah.
And so I had to resist a lot of the temptations that came along the way. But I do actually think that I had to tell myself a different story about who I am. I'm like, I would say things to myself like, you're the type of person who, even if you go off track, because they let you have like free days on the actual holiday day because they knew you were going to be with friends and family. And I would say to myself, "Okay, Allie, you're gonna go off plan tomorrow." And you're now the type of person who, even if you have 1 or 2 days that are off plan, you get right back on track the next day. And
Mm,
I think having some level of accountability, meaning that I knew that there was gonna be somebody who asked me, "How much do you weigh? And did you go off plan? And if so, what did you eat?" Like, I think there was a little bit of, like, the external, but I think just telling myself, like, "This is now who you are. You are now this person," right? Same thing around drinking or sweets. I now tell myself I am now the type of person who, like, once a week, I allow myself to indulge a little bit, whether that's in some sort of alcoholic drink or whether that's some sort of sweet, and you're the type of person who gets right back on track the next day, right? Yeah, I mean,
mm,
and I
mhm,
just wanna throw in one other thing. One of the things that helped me really shift around the health and the eating was when I did go off plan, I would feel horrible. So, like, eating sweets on Christmas or having 2 glasses of champagne made me feel physically not good, And so because I had been going along in one certain way for so long, and then I allowed myself to go back to the old way, it was now the old way that felt gross and not good. And so I think
Mm,
that actually was a catalyst for continuing in the new way, was
mm.
that when I went back to the old way, it felt really, really bad.
Nice. I like that. It's a really good example. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What about you?
So it's so interesting because I feel as if the real identity shifts that I have had, I only saw them afterwards. So there are 2 examples I can give. I think one being the money example, that was a time where I really made a conscious decision, and then I had to put the work in to do it forwards. And I've spoken a little bit about that in previous episodes, but I think an example of where I feel like it's been a shift that I it wasn't intentional in the sense that it wasn't my intention to make that particular shift.
Mhm.
And I think it's really around my own creativity and and the shift from how I identify myself through my career. And so one of the things that I feel like I was stuck in for a long time was I really, really wanted to change career. And it's funny, it's only after I made that internal shift that I could see why it was so hard for me to change.
Mhm.
When I was actually trying to change, I couldn't understand why I wasn't making the decisions that I would have to make in order to change. And so when I started doing things like writing my blog and writing my books and everything, I the shift that was for me, I never really thought of myself as a creative person, right? And so the shift for me was there's many types of creativity, you are a creative person and shifting into feeling grounded into that identity, what I realized it was a lot easier for me to make other changes when I shifted out of being really grounded into my career and how people saw me. And you talked earlier about the systems that you belong to, your family system. My family is not such a big deal because all of us have changed career at some point in time or not. But it's society and almost the feeling of like, why would this is such a prestigious career. And I think when I really almost grounded into seeing myself through that creative lens, it was a lot easier to be less attached to other identities. So it's not like I had a big shift from one identity to another, but I feel like I was suddenly standing in a different place and I could see some of those other identities and I could really start to then make the changes around those that I would need to do.
Right.
That help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think both of our shifts are really about who you see yourself as, who
Mhm.
you say that you are, and then not only that, but what are the actions that you then start to take based on who you see yourself as and who you say you are, right?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Right. Well, yeah, I love thinking about identity. I love thinking about what becomes possible when we start to shift our identities because even, like smaller examples, like whenever I talk to people who say things like, I always remember this time I was chatting to someone who I met years ago. And, she was telling me she really would love to become a nurse.
Mhm.
And I was like, you should totally go after it. And she was like, no, I'm not a good student. I was never good at school. And I'm like, "You're 40, like, it's
Right.
been 20 something years," like and I think then I didn't really understand the stories can be those micro stories, right? It can be the, "I'm terrible at this," or, "I'm not" for her, it was like, "I'm a terrible student." For some people, it's like, "Oh, I'm really bad at math." So, like, I've heard that with entrepreneurs. It's like, you wanna scale your business. "Oh, I'm really bad at math." Like, "What are you talking about? Oh, you run a household for the last how many ever years." And so it's almost even in the face of what might be evidence that those stories aren't true, you kind of use them to to do that sabotage and to not kind of move forward with those things.
Right.
So I like the examples you gave with the eating of the little micro things, like, I'm the sort of person who can get back on track. And just those little micro shifts
Right.
I really like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, people are probably tired of hearing me say it because I'm like a broken record. But if people really want to shift their lives, it's really one micro step at a time. It's
Mm,
often not in the huge leaps. The micro steps allow you to take the bigger leaps, right? They are the springboard for the big leaps.
yeah, and so it's like micro story, micro step, micro action, build
Yes.
all building towards a larger story, larger identity, and larger shifts.
Yeah, I didn't lose 25 pounds in 5 weeks, right? Like, uh, I lost it 1 pound at a time, one choice at a time, and there were fluctuations along the way. It wasn't just down the entire time. And so, yeah, right now I can look at myself or look at the way that I'm feeling in my clothes or the way the clothes look at me or whatever. People look at me and they're like, that's a big change. And I'm like, yeah, it was a big change that was hard fought through micro steps every single day. Right.
Yeah, okay, I like it. So if someone who's listening knows that they're no longer who they used to be, but they're not fully sure who they are becoming yet, what is something that you would love to tell that person?
I would just want them to know that the not knowing of who you're going to become, it does not mean that you are doing anything wrong. It just means that you're probably in the middle of a very real transformation. And that middle part is super uncomfortable because it asks you to release certainty before the new shape of your life has fully revealed itself to you. And that this is the place where a lot of people panic because in this space, we all want the immediate clarity. We want to know exactly who we're becoming, what we want, how exactly it's all going to unfold. But identity shifts do not always, and more often than not, they don't work that way. Sometimes it takes time for the old self to fall away before that new self can fully emerge. It's like, I'm thinking of this is so cheesy, but I love nature metaphors because I feel like, we are a part of nature. And it's like in the fall, the leaves don't all automatically fall to the ground all at the same time. There is a gradual shift that starts happening where the green turns to red and yellow and orange, and then some of the leaves fall off the tree, and then, by the time that it's winter, then it's bare, and then there's room for new in the spring, right? And so sometimes you can and you will outgrow things before you even know what's coming next. So I would
Mhm.
just want that person to know that, like, slow down. You don't have to rush to define yourself just because the old version of you no longer fits. You don't have to keep living in the old way if you're finding that that doesn't feel good, but you don't also have to be living in the new way as well, right?
I like it. That
Yeah,
sounds great. Sounds like a
wonderful.
great place to bring it to a close.
All right. Yeah, sounds good. So, if after listening to today's conversation, you are recognizing that the version of you that you have been living from is no longer the version of you that you want to keep carrying, and you're ready to shift your identity at the root, hypnotherapy is one of the most powerful ways to do that. Because identity is not just a conscious thought, it's something that lives deep in your subconscious mind through patterns, beliefs, emotional associations, and stories that have been repeated over time in your life. And that is exactly why trying to change on the surface can feel so hard. You're trying to build a new life from an old identity, and hypnotherapy helps you go deeper. And if that's something that you're ready for, I would absolutely love to support you. Head to shiftyourstorypodcast.com where you can schedule a connection call or message me on Facebook or Instagram. I would love to connect with you, hear what's coming up for you, chat about how I can best support you in shifting the subconscious beliefs, patterns, and identities that may be keeping you stuck. All right. I hope that this was helpful, and we're sending you so much love and gratitude. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to send me a message on social media. I'm at the Allie Rose on both Facebook and Instagram. And if you want to be coached on a future episode or explore what it would look like to work with me one-on-one, head over to shiftyourstorypodcast.com. And if you never want to miss an episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review. It helps more people find this work. Until next time, keep shifting, keep growing, and most importantly, I want you to remember that your story isn't set in stone. You always have the power to shift it.